Okay. Thank you all. Okay. So we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics today. The name of this training and little didactic we're going to do here today is just a very brief overview of the 4 pivots, and it has to do around healing justice. And I frame this training today around really looking at a holistic approach to how we support youth growth and youth resilience. There's going to be a book that I reference today, and that's where the 4 pivots comes from. It looks like this, if you can see my little square down there. It's an amazing book written by Sean Ginwright. He is a researcher in California, but also does a lot of like boots on the ground work out there as well. So I really like a lot of his perspectives. So we're going to talk about how we shift our thoughts around wellness. We're going to do, like I said, a pretty brief overview of healing justice, the framework, and then talk mostly about these 4 pivots that Dr. Ginwright talks about in his book. And then I'm going to go through briefly some of the strategies you can implement into your practices. But I also provided a handout with some links that give you ideas how to implement each of the 4 pivots into your practices, and it has some really good resources there for you as well. So when we think about wellness, we are not just looking at the absence of illness, right? So it's very multidimensional, very dynamic. And why I bring this up is because it's going to be crucial as we have this discussion today around healing justice, that we understand these different dimensions of wellness. So looking at the wellness wheel here, this shows all of the different dimensions of wellness. And that's 8 areas. So it's a lot more than just not being sick, right? So we're talking about our physical wellness, our mental wellness, our emotional wellness, our occupational wellness, environmental wellness. I think on the next slide, we'll show them to you a little bit more organized here to see what each of these different areas really encompasses. When we look at the healing justice model, we're going to look at how this is really a holistic approach to wellness. So we are truly encompassing all of these different dimensions. And when we neglect one, it can really affect the others. So think in your mind for a second, what comes to your mind as I say healing justice? Is there anything you already know about it? Is there anything that you can kind of make an educated guess around if it's a term that maybe you haven't heard before, a framework that you're not, that you haven't heard of before? So healing justice really addresses generational trauma. We're looking at systemic violence, oppression, reviving this ancestral healing practice, and really looking at a collective healing model. So how can we serve the youth and families that we serve if we don't also collectively look at our own experiences, the experiences of those people that came before us in our personal lives, but also our professional lives? How do we holistically respond and intervene on this intergenerational trauma and violence? Sean Ginwright talks about it as reimagining justice, reimagining ourselves in his book. And he talks a lot about the juvenile justice world, and that's a lot of where his work is done. But I think it's a model that can really be implemented anywhere where you're working with people, specifically because these collective practices really impact and transform the oppression on our collective bodies. And he speaks about the collective as just all humans. Everyone is interconnected in this way. And if we can collectively heal, then we're providing better treatment, better services to people. So here's the book. by Dr. Jen Wright that I will talk about as we move into the 4 pivots. Like I said, I think he provides valuable guidance for mental health professionals, anyone working with youth and families, because he really emphasizes the importance of self-reflection, transformative relationships, strengths-based approaches, and well-being in general. So I think by integrating these pivots into our practice, we can better support youth growth and resilience within this healing justice framework. So the 4 pivots as a whole, pivot 1 is from lens to mirror. So really in this pivot, we shift from viewing youth through a lens of judgment to looking inward, reflecting on our own biases, our own beliefs. And this is where self-awareness really plays that crucial role in how we support true change. Pivot 2 is from transactional to transformative relationships. So we're really going beyond surface interactions. We're going beyond the, hi, how was your day? How is everything going for you? Things like that, in building more meaningful connections and getting to know the youth that we're working with. Transformative relationships have the ability to really empower youth to then discover their own strengths and potential. From problem to possibility is pivot 3. Looking at, instead of solely focusing on problems, this pivot really encourages the strengths-based approach. So by embracing possibility, we create a space for youth to envision a brighter future that goes beyond maybe why they presented to you in the first place in your work. And then pivot 4, from hustle to flow, is really shifting that culture of constant striving, this hustle culture that we've kind of live in. How do we foster an environment where a youth can really experience flow, find balance and engagement in activities they actually enjoy, and balance that with things maybe they have to do, because even kids have responsibilities, teenagers have responsibilities, there's things that they don't want to do, and you will probably hear about those things they don't want to do, and you can help them to find the balance with the things they do want to do. That flow state really allows them to fully immerse themselves and find that sense of purpose. And that's where I think a lot of the strengths come from. So I kind of just gave the broad overview of each pivot, but what I think is really important here to bring up is in this pivot from lens to mirror, how do I consciously examine my own biases and assumptions when I'm working with the youth? And then when implementing this pivot in your work, I think it's important to schedule some time for yourself to be introspective, to explore those biases, those beliefs, and then to ask yourself how they're impacting your interactions with youth. Doing this a lot when you notice things coming up for yourself, when you feel judgment, like that's really struggling, it's really making it difficult for you to engage, whether it's with a youth or it's with a family. And then there are some interventions, and again, these are going to be on the resource list that I provided, some external resources that you can kind of do for yourself to really bring these pivots into implementation. So pivot 2, again, is urging us to go beyond those surface interactions, building deep, meaningful connections with the youth and empowering them to also discover their strengths. So asking yourself in this pivot, do I truly engage with youth on a deeper level, or do I tend to maintain surface level interactions? Now, to anyone who comes from maybe a therapy lens or a clinician lens, this might sound a little counterintuitive to what you've been taught as far as self-disclosure. And there is a way to ethically, whether, whatever code of ethics you come from, ethically create deeper connections without making time with a client about your own self-disclosure. So I think intentionally setting aside time during sessions where You build a meaningful connection with them by actively listening and validating their experiences as a completely appropriate and ethical way to bring in deeper connection. I think sometimes when we think deeper connection, it goes straight to, well, I tell them my personal stories and then we have this connection over that, which is why I think peer support is one of those fundamental roles in youth and families' lives, because they can do that. But looking at it from like a clinical lens, it's difficult to, and goes against self-disclosure. But there are ways in our work as clinicians too, where we can do this. And some of the interventions that I have on the resource list for this are really around like relationship building activities. And there's like a toolkit there for some ideas. Pivot 3, asking yourself, am I primarily focused on fixing problems, or am I empowering youth to explore their strengths and potential? Am I coming from this strength-based lens to create a space where they can see a future beyond their challenges? In this pivot, I gave some interventions around strength-based work, but also some just kind of practical toolkits as well to help youth, especially transition aged youth, as they begin to think about like going off on their own and thinking about this future that is not maybe living at home with their caregiver or wherever they're at the time when you're working with them. So some of them are practical as far as like teaching them some skills, but some of them are also around how do we even help them identifying their strengths, and how do we celebrate those unique strengths that they have. And then pivot 4, shifting from hustle to flow. I think sometimes in our culture, I feel like, especially since COVID, we can't shut things off, right? So we are fully immersed in this hustle culture of, we can see someone is always doing something and it's in our face, and we may say, well, I'm not doing anything right now, I should be doing something. So this really challenges us to shift our focus. And by using this in our practices with the families we serve and the kids we work with, we want to engage them in activities that they're passionate about, providing them a space for them to experience that flow and bring about that intrinsic motivation. Some of the techniques here are around like mindfulness and coping mechanisms to be able to find flow, but some of them are also around like, what are they passionate about? How do we know what would put them from this hustle to flow state? And then some of them are around really creating balance in their lives. So we want to offer them opportunities to engage in those things they're passionate about, and how do we help them do that? Another thing Dr. Ginwright talks about is how all of these pivots are interconnected. So it's not to say that we do one or the other, it's to say they all work together to create this transformative healing for the kids that we're working with, the families we're working with, anyone, really, ourselves in this collective healing model. So thinking about, how do I integrate all of these pivots together? So laying them out one by one, it sounds like it is a very comprehensive approach, but it's a lot of things to do. So if you can recognize maybe there is a pivot where you struggle a little bit more, start there. And then use the other pivots again to start to build those skills for yourself. Do that deeper introspection. That is one that I always recommend. If you're struggling with where to start, introspection will tell you a lot about other areas where you may need to lean a little more time into. Some of these things you may already be doing. It may, again, come from just your natural approach to treatment, the way that you work with youth and families, but some of them can be, maybe they're not what we're taught in school, or they're not what we're taught with productivity standards and things like that. So bringing it back to what is best for the youth and families that we're working with. So I want to dive just kind of into this essential question of why we implement healing justice, and just some things for you all to think about before we finish up. How or why were you called into this work? How are you currently supporting your own healing, wellness, and health? What does it look like for young people when we don't have structures in place that support their mental health and healing? How does your organization, school, business agency currently support young people? Thinking about your own personal journey, what's motivated you? What brought you into this field? I think now we're beginning to recognize, especially after being told we're in this youth mental health crisis and seeing that every day doing the work that we do, we're recognizing that we do have a lot of structures in place that do not support mental wellness and healing for our youth. How in your work can you make an impact on that? And my hope is that implementing these 4 pivots is a really good place to start for that. So I didn't time this out well. My time is coming to an end here. So we're not going to brainstorm these 3 ways. And I was worried about that, which is why I gave you a long list of interventions and ways that you can go and start to implement these 4 pivots in your work. But I did want to open just to see if there were any questions or any comments about what we talked about here today before we move into our case.